I want to ask you, really, as we dive into this, have you ever been in a situation when you were wondering, am I about to die? I've had a few of those moments in my life. In fact, this past week, before we were thawing out, I was walking just through my neighborhood, the frozen tundra of my neighborhood, and I literally bit it almost twice. Fortunately, I caught myself slip sliding away down the streets. And I thought myself for a moment, man, I could have died right there. I could have hit my head, you know. I've wondered it at the wheel of a car in a full 360 in somebody's front yard in the midst of a rainstorm when I was spinning out of control. I've wondered it when I was barreling down a ski slope without my poles, completely out of control, headed for the backside of somebody at the bottom of the mountain. Some of you know that story. I've wondered it while I've been jerked around a small prop plane, bouncing around over the desert of Northern California in the heat of the summer. Am I about to die? And I have to tell you that I think the disciples of Jesus had their share of days with Jesus when they were wondering the same thing. Am I about to die? And some of those days, I think we've actually been reading about this past week. If you're a guest here for the first time, we are in the midst of a journey through the Gospel of Mark, and we're reading through a little bit of the Gospel of Mark every day using just these handy little guides, our marked journals. You can still pick one up in the lobby if you don't. We have been in Mark chapter 4 and verse 26. That's where our readings start this past week on Monday. And this covers the section all the way to Mark 6 and verse 6. That's pages 58 through 77 in your journal. And the notes page for this message is on page 78. So again, we read a little bit of Mark every day during the week. And then on the weekend, we come together and I share a message reflecting on where it is we've all been reading during the week. And I'm primarily going to focus just on 3 stories from our reading this past week and have some reflections and applications for our lives. Without a doubt, this has been the most action-packed section of the Gospel of Mark yet, in my opinion. In fact, I ran across a picture recently, and I just thought of the disciples when I saw this picture. I think that's about how they felt, believe it or not. Just one thing after the other happens, and they're quite frazzled. And if you know anything about these disciples, they're not easily intimidated men. Most of them have been hardened and toughened by their lives and by their jobs. Some of them are commercial fishermen. And yet they had their moments in life with Jesus where they had to be asking, am I going to die today? The first story we see of this is the first one we launched into this past week, Mark 4, 35 through 41, actually a couple days into the week. This is definitely the case with this story. Jesus gets done teaching, and he tells the disciples he wants to get in a boat and go to the other side of the lake. It's actually the body of water they're on is the Sea of Galilee. We know this from the other Gospels. I've had the privilege of visiting the Sea of Galilee in a trip to Israel a few years ago. Of all things, it's where we left my mother's ashes, in the Sea of Galilee. It actually sits below sea level. In certain times of the year, cold air from Mount Hermon, that's like a 10,000-foot mountain, comes crashing down to the Sea of Galilee, that body of water that's 700 feet below sea level. It's below sea level, so you have all this humidity colliding with this cold air from Mount Hermon, and the end result is some pretty spectacular thunderstorms over this body of water, or squalls, as you'll read about here. They still happen today. Mark writes about a furious squall. That had to be a really bad squall in verse 37 of chapter 4. And it must have been to have almost swamped the boat of commercial fishermen who know how to handle a boat. But of all things, where is Jesus? He is sleeping on a cushion in the stern of the boat. And the disciples wake him. Note, it's not the storm that wakes Jesus. It's the disciples that wake Jesus. And they ask him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, Be still. That's like all he does. He has no comment to them. And notice that Jesus doesn't say, in the name of so-and-so, be quiet. He doesn't quote a higher authority because there is no higher authority to quote. Remember the meaning of the term authority that I unpacked with you a few weeks ago. The word authority literally comes from the word author, which means original stuff. Jesus is the origin of the natural world. Paul's going to say later in Colossians 1 that all things were created through him. All he has to say is quiet, be still. He doesn't have to say in the name of, because he's the origin of it all. And then Mark writes, then the wind died down and it was completely calm. Now think about this. Have you ever been on a body of water after a storm? The waters are still choppy for hours on end. I once made the mistake of going deep sea fishing after a terrible storm on the Gulf of Mexico. Maybe the waves were 7 to 8 feet. I was sick as a dog the whole day. Longest day of my life. But I want you to think about a body of water that almost swamps a boat. Choppy for hours on end. Then Jesus says what he says, and it goes completely calm. You ever been on the corner of a lake in the evening? When it's completely still, it's like glass. Can you imagine going from this kind of turbulence in the water to like that at the sound of a voice? Jesus then says to the disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Notice the disciples are still terrified, only the source of their terror is completely different. It's no longer the storm. Instead of the wind and the waves rocking their boat, it's now the man in the middle of their boat. Instead of the squall being completely unmanageable, now they're dealing with how unmatchable is the one sitting in the middle of our boat. The one we've been following all along. And they've got their questions. They're wondering how much he cared for them at some point in the midst of all the turbulence when they say, teacher, don't you care if we drown? And when Jesus responded, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? I kind of wonder if it's a double-edged question. First, is he addressing their lack of faith, that he has authority over the wind and the waves, just like he has authority over demons and disease, which we've already seen? Or secondly, is it that they lack faith that he cares for them? I think for most people, they have no problem believing he has authority over the wind and the waves. I think it's the second level. I think there are a lot of people who struggle with a faith. Does he really care for me? The disciples asked this question, don't you care if we drown? And it speaks to me at even a deeper level. Underneath the question, there might even be a premise. If you cared in the first place, would we even be in this position? But a relationship with Jesus does not guarantee a squall-free life. Just because you're in a squall, just because you're in a storm, doesn't mean that he doesn't care for you. Because so often, it's squalls that put you in position to come to a greater revelation of just who it is that's been in your boat all along. They didn't know Jesus had authority over the wind and the waves until they encountered some wind and waves. Sometimes you don't know how personal God is until you encounter something that's overwhelming to you and you experience him in the midst of the overwhelming nature of it. They didn't know Jesus had authority over the wind and the waves until there were wind and waves. Notice they're calling him teacher still in the middle of a squall before he calms the wind and the waves. They have yet to call him Lord in the Gospel of Mark. But they're on their way. And the storm is going to help them get there. The bigger and more personally threatening the squall is, I think the bigger and more personal the Lord becomes when we see him at work in the midst of it. The story begins with Jesus telling them to get to the boat, let's go to the other side. But I think the other side isn't just a geographic location on the Sea of Galilee. I think the other side is a bigger and far more personal revelation of just who it is that's in your boat. You may have Jesus at the center of your circle, like we talked about last week. You may have a history of following Jesus, but that doesn't mean that you're done seeing all of him that there is to see. Every now and then, it takes a squall, a storm, to help you see more of him. And I would just ask you right now, have you been through a squall recently that maybe you're looking at it right now with fresh eyes? Or maybe you're in the middle of a storm right now. Before blaming Jesus for it, look for him in the midst of it. Ask for help to see him in the midst of it. And just when you thought it couldn't get any crazier, they finally get to the shore on the other side. Which brings you to the next story. This is Mark 5, 1 through 20. They had to be relieved to hit dry land. But the relief didn't last for long. Verse 1. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. And so just to help you see this in your mind, there's a welcoming committee that greets Jesus, a rather large committee of demons that have taken up residence in one person. And over, this thing keeps happening in the Gospel of Mark, if you've been reading, that you keep having demons confessing the identity of Jesus. They're like the most active evangelist of everyone. Human beings still haven't caught on. But when Jesus encounters demons, demons are crying out. They know who's in charge. They don't like it, but they know it. Notice their view of him. "Have you come to destroy us?" We read that in Mark 1, a demon cries out. Mark 5, "Have you come to torture us?" Interesting how the demonic sees Jesus. They know who's in charge. They fear him. They just don't like him. What you also see here is a window into spiritual oppression and bondage. The man can't be constrained by chains. No one was strong enough to subdue him from the outside in. The solution was going to have to be through Jesus working on him from the inside out. You also see the nature of the enemy here. The nature of the enemy is to seek to inhabit you, isolate you, and ultimately destroy you through you destroying yourself. The man lives in the tombs in isolation. He cries out and he cuts himself with stones. This is a picture of spiritual oppression. This is a picture of bondage. And what's important to understand is oppression and bondage can take place in many forms, in many ways. You can have a lot of things going on for you circumstantially and still be enslaved on the road to isolation, crying out, cutting yourself. I live in a suburb. I'm telling you, there are people in isolation in Coppell who are crying out and cutting themselves with stones. They're torturing themselves spiritually. It happens. I'm not talking literally right now. It happens. This is the nature of what the enemy does. He's a cutting horse. He wants to isolate us and work on us from the inside out so that we wind up destroying ourselves. You can have a lot of things going on for you circumstantially and be in complete bondage. The story continues, verse 11. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus. Notice, they still know who's in control. Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them. It's interesting. You can know who's in control and still want to try and do deals with him. Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them. He gave them permission. And the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number. I mean, get this in your mind. About 2,000 in number rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. What a scene. Can you imagine being the disciples? You go from the storm, thinking you're going to drown, to the guy in your boat calms the storm. You get off on dry land and you think, man, it's good to be on dry land. Then you got some lunatic possessed by 2,000 demons that comes up and is the first person to greet you. This is not getting any better. Then you watch this exchange where Jesus strangely gives permission for the spirits to enter into the pigs. And what do the spirits do? They drive 2,000 pigs down a bank into the lake. I always like to say this is the first case of deviled ham in the Bible. And it's packed in water like they do at the deli section. But I worked on that very hard, by the way. But it is an old one. I've used it before, I would confess to you. But now here's the deal. In all seriousness, again, look at the nature of the enemy. The nature of the enemy is to inhabit anything. He'll even take an animal. The nature of the enemy is to oppress and destroy anything that God has made. Anything. Verse 14. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Second story in a row. You find people who were once fearful of one thing. Jesus comes on the scene, solves that situation, but now they're afraid of him because of the power at work. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. The people are so freaked out themselves by the transformation of the man, by the mass suicide of the pigs, and the economic loss, I think, of the pigs, that they begged Jesus to leave their region. They didn't know what to do in the face of such power. Jesus leaves, but not the testimony of him. What's interesting is the newly delivered man begs Jesus to go with him. By the way, have you noticed all the begging in the story? All kinds of begging. Demons are begging Jesus, send us in the pigs. A town is begging Jesus to leave. The man healed is begging Jesus, let me go with you. And yet that's one thing Jesus won't let him do. He won't let him come with him. Jesus says this in verse 19, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, how he's had mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. By the way, this is such a great definition of a testimony. It's simply telling people what the Lord has done for you and how much mercy he's had on you. If you've never stopped, I would encourage you to again consider what difference has the Lord made in my life. Listen, don't be paralyzed. There will always be questions that people have for you that you won't have answers to. It happens to me too. Don't let what you don't know keep you from sharing what you do know. Don't let what you don't know keep you from sharing what you do know. And he says, Jesus says, I want you to go home and tell the people how much the Lord has done for you and how much mercy he's had on you. Now, here's what's interesting. This guy goes back to the Decapolis, which is a community of 10 villages, and he begins to tell his story. How do I know he begins to tell his story? Because you're going to see in a couple chapters in Mark, when Jesus comes deeper into that area, they're ready for him because they've heard of him. They've heard the guy's story. Here's what's interesting. This is Gentile country. When Jesus and the disciples get in the Gerasenes on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, they're on the wrong side of the tracks. They're now in Gentile country. These people aren't Jews. Do you understand what Jesus is doing? He is for the whole world. And his message is for the whole world. And of all things, this former demon-possessed man is the first missionary to the Gentile world. You ought to be interested in that, because I think 99.5% of our church are Gentiles. The first missionary to the Gentile world is this man. And he starts spreading his testimony. We leave him. Jesus gets back in the boat with the disciples. They sail back to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. You got to wonder, what are the disciples now thinking? Mark 5, 21 through 43 is your next story. When they land on the other side, Jesus is swallowed by crowds that are waiting for him. And there are two stories that unfold. The first is of a woman who's been bleeding for years. She presses forward to touch Jesus in a crowd, and she's healed when she touches his clothes. It's so interesting, by the way, the personality of the gospel writers. You know, Mark, when he tells the story, talks about how she's suffered at the hands of physicians and has spent all she had. Luke tells the same story. He doesn't say anything about her suffering at the hands of physicians or going broke. Why? Because Luke's a doctor. He's not going to rat out his own vocation. I love the personality of the gospel writers. We could talk about that some other time. But Mark, he ain't a doctor, so he might be giving it to Luke, you know, in the small group there. Who knows? But here's a woman. Nobody could help her. She's gone broke looking for healing. She presses forward. She touches him in the crowd. She experiences healing. But there's a second story. All this happens while Jesus is on the way to raise a young girl from the dead. And so now you have a total of 4 stories back to back that you've been in Mark. Just zoom out for a second. I want you to see this. The disciples ask at the end of Mark 4, "Who is this?" And then boom, you find out he has authority over the wind and the waves. Mark 4, 35 through 41. Next story, he has authority over the demonic again. Mark 5, 1 through 20. Next story, he has authority over sickness. Mark 5, 21 through 34. Next story, he has authority over death. He raises that girl from the dead. The disciples are in the middle of every one of these encounters, and every encounter brings them a greater awareness of just who it is that they've been following. Every encounter is ripe with fear and drama and desperation on the part of people in need. Jesus is answering the question, who is this? And this is the question the disciples are asking. And he does it through working in the midst of their experiences. He doesn't do it through teaching them propositions like I'm doing right now. This is why a lot of what I do with you, it can be helpful for a time, but it doesn't really sink into you until you live in it. I'm just giving you a way to name it when it happens. I'm just helping you to look for it when it happens. This is the weakness of propositional preaching, of us sitting in a room like this under lights, looking at the back of people's heads, nodding, going, "Oh yeah, completely reasonable." Voice calming the waves, completely reasonable. Resurrection, "Oh yeah, I'm familiar with this." Let me tell you what. If those kinds of things happened here, you'd probably fire me for allowing it to happen here. No, Jesus' education plan, in many ways, is to work in real time through experiences in their lives. Not just to set people free, but he's answering the question that the disciples are asking, who is this? He's got authority over wind and waves, demons, sickness, death. The truth is, it's not points on a sheet of paper that's going to convince you of what Jesus is greater than. It's encounters with the very things that so often intimidate you in your life. The disciples didn't know he was Lord of the wind and waves until they had some wind and waves. And the wild ride doesn't let up. Only now the disciples are going to face stress of a different kind. And this is the last reading for this week. They're going to face the stress of going home with Jesus. That's Mark 6, 1 through 6. It tells the story of Jesus meeting resistance in his own hometown among people who've known him the longest. You have to remember, this is the same town where Jesus spoke about having authority to forgive sins. This is the same town where he claimed to be Lord of the Sabbath. They come back home to Jesus' town where he set up headquarters for a little while. Peter's home is also there. And there's been a lot that's been happening. The rumor mill's been churning. He comes back, and people in his own hometown, they just couldn't get over Jesus saying the kind of things he was saying and doing the kind of things he was doing, because some of them had known Jesus since he was in sackcloth diapers. And the story concludes with these sobering words. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home." He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. Stop right there. That's just considered no big deal. He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. I tell you what, that's one way I really don't want to amaze Jesus. He was amazed at their lack of faith. The disciples are privy to all this drama in Jesus' hometown, and the wild ride's going to continue into the readings this week. Let's pull up. Let me leave you with two reflections over this large chunk of Scripture we've been in this past week. The first is this: Jesus is wonderful. Two L's. That's not misspelled. I put a dash in there. Jesus is wonderful. One of the things reading through Mark, I hope, is doing for you is restoring a sense of wonder when it comes to Jesus. There are so many miraculous things that happen, from a dramatic exorcisms to healings to the forgiving of sins to a resurrection. Don't miss the wonder. He rules over the wind, the waves, the demonic, sickness, and death. And I would just say, when's the last time you prayed like that? I'm thinking about a pastor, Mark Galley. He's in Sacramento, and the church he's been in has developed a ministry through the years to hundreds of Laotian refugees who've settled there. And one year he decided to host this group in his home, and they would read through a gospel together and eat a meal together. And most of these Laotians were not followers of Christ. They got to the story of Jesus rebuking the wind and the waves, and Mark did what he normally did with American believers. He spiritualized the story first. Began talking about how Jesus calms the storms of our lives, how we have trouble and crisis and anxiety, and yet Jesus can bring peace. And he began to ask them what storms they have in their lives that Jesus could calm. And they looked puzzled. And so Mark repeated the question. He said, you know, what storms do you have in your life that he can calm? And one of the men raised his hand really hesitantly and asked, "Do you mean that Jesus actually calmed the wind and the sea in the middle of a storm?" And Mark thought they didn't believe the story, but he didn't want to get into arguing about miracles. So he replied, "Well, yes, but we shouldn't get hung up on the details of the miracle. We should remember that Jesus calms the storms of our lives." And this awkward stretch of silence just continued until another man replied, "Well, if Jesus calmed the wind and the waves, he must be powerful." And they all started nodding vigorously in the room, chattered excitedly with one another in their native language. Mark couldn't understand what they were saying. Everyone in the room was full of wonder except the guy leading the Bible study. It can happen. And he suddenly realized at that moment they may be grasping Jesus better than he was. For some of us, losing our wonder when it comes to Jesus is the beginning of us wandering from him. When you lose your wonder, pay attention. It's the beginning of us wandering from him. Jesus is wonderful. Having said that, I've got to speak to a question. I'm sure it's bouncing around in some hearts right now. Chris, I believe these stories, but I also know too many stories where there's no wonder that happened. My loved one stayed oppressed. The storm didn't die. The report came in and it was negative. And the same could be said for people back then. Not everyone was healed when Jesus was walking the earth. The text says that he heals many of them, not all of them. We don't know why. And certainly, there were only a few raised from the dead that we know of. You say, what do you do with that? I would say this: Jesus is more than an emergency room physician. We mustn't forget, while we're filled with wonder at the signs of his power in our natural world, the signs are pointing somewhere. They point to, dare I say, more important realities. Like he said in Mark 2, he heals the paralytic so that they would know he has the power to forgive sins. The signs are pointing somewhere. Like glow-in-the-dark exit signs in our room, the signs aren't there for you to gather and just stand underneath the exit sign and go, oh, exit sign, oh, exit sign. No, when God moves in a way that glows in the dark, it's a sign to point you to a reality beyond it. It's an exit sign. It says, yes, I've had mercy on this body, but I want you to pay attention to what I say about sin and the soul and the human heart. I want you to step into a different reality. Come this way. And that's exactly what they're meant to do. As wonderful as it is that he has authority over sickness and wind and waves and demons and even death, these signs point to a more significant work that he wants to do with our sin and the transformation of our hearts, which brings me to the second thing. And I'll close with this. That's so wonderful about him. Jesus is for the unclean. In Mark 5, when Jesus sets foot in the region of the Gerasenes and does what he does with a demonized man, he's going somewhere Jewish rabbis didn't go. There's a big emphasis among the Jews and the rabbis about staying away from unclean things. You couldn't touch a dead body. Pigs were unclean. The dead are unclean. The demons are unclean. Jesus is in Gentile country, an unclean country, in the land of pigs, dealing with a man who's possessed by demons in a graveyard. He's like dealing with a quadruple shot of unclean. There's something happening here. And he doesn't run away. The other healing stories in Mark, the one where the paralytic is brought to Jesus, somebody's advocating for him. 4 dudes lower him at the feet of Jesus. The other healing stories in Mark, you have people advocating for people who are suffering. Here's what's so powerful about this. There's no one advocating for the demoniac. He's alone. Listen to me very closely. Some of you have had no one advocating for you except for Jesus. Jesus advocates for him. Nobody else asked Jesus to take care of the demoniac. But Jesus advocates for him. Same thing with the woman with the issue of blood. Nobody's advocating for her. She's unclean because of how she's bleeding and the laws of that culture. She's bleeding out. People are keeping their distance. Nobody advocates for her. Jesus is for the unclean. And you know what? Jesus didn't have to stop and ask the question of who touched him. You mentioned the disciples. What do you mean, who touched you? You got a crowd of people around you. Jesus like, who touched me? Jesus didn't ask that for his sake. I think he asked it for hers. And I think because there was more healing that needed to take place than simply her bleeding. Did you notice he calls her daughter? She probably hadn't been called daughter in years, because when you are treated as unclean in that culture, you are seen as being under the judgment of God. When Jesus says, who touched me, I don't think it was for his sake. I think it was for hers, because there was more healing that needed to happen. She needed to see the face of the one who has authority over everything and hear him call her daughter. That's probably true for a lot of us. There's something about being called son and daughter by the one who has authority over it all. I'm going to tell you what, the longer I've walked with Jesus, the more I've come to see that I've needed to have things healed and transformed in my life that I didn't know needed to be healed and transformed. You ever had a long drink of water and you didn't realize how thirsty you were? You ever sat down to eat a meal and you didn't realize, I didn't know how hungry I was? That's what it is with Jesus. The longer you walk with Jesus, the more you see how much you've been missing of him. The longer you walk with Jesus, the more you begin to realize, wow, I got places in my heart and my life I didn't know that needed to be healed. I didn't know that needed to be transformed. Layer after layer. That's why a lot of times he'll ask a question and invite you into ownership and to come out. Just like her. It wasn't for his sake. It was for hers. Because she had another place that needed to be healed. Well, I think it's time to pull up. I'm going to ask you just to bow your head right where you are. And I want to walk you through just 3 themes in prayer. The first is this. I want you thinking right now, if you're in a squall, if you're in a storm, take a moment and say, Lord, help me to see you. And just pray about that. Help me to see where you are in it. If you've come out of one and you've learned something about him and yourself, give him thanks for it right now. Now, I want you to think about somebody. It could be somebody you love. It could be yourself. And they're tormented, or you're tormented. It just seems like it's getting worse for the person or for yourself. There's been a lot of pressure from the outside in trying to control you or that person. But you or that person needs the help of the Lord from the inside out. Take a moment and pray. Ask for his help for yourself or for somebody you love. Now think about somebody you know, or it could be yourself, who needs to again realize their identity as a son or a daughter. Take a moment and pray that the Lord would manifest himself to that person, or maybe to you. Jesus, I thank you for your presence. We thank you for the grace of these stories being recorded. I'm mindful there are people who lost their lives, that the stories might be written down and circulated, translated into different languages. There are people who lost their lives to circulate these gospels. And I pray that today we would find more and more life through you in these gospels. Lord, I pray you would continue your ministry among us. Give us yourself as we sit with you during the week and even in these moments. We see ourselves in these stories, in squalls, in graveyards, in crowds reaching out. We see ourselves being healed in multiple ways, being delivered of all kinds of things. We thank you for your mercy, and we pray you continue your good work among us. In Jesus' name, won't you be standing? Let's invite you. Will you just worship with me in song as we speak the name of Jesus again over these prayers just for a moment?